Welcome to The Art of Medicine, the program that explores the arts, business, and clinical aspects of the practice of medicine. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilner, and my guest today is Dr. Jennifer Frontera. Welcome, Dr. Frontera.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Dr. Frontera, you are a neurocritical care specialist and a professor of neurology at NYU, at the Grossman School of Medicine in New York City, right? So I
That's
think
correct.
New York City has a special relevance for anyone that we're going to talk about COVID today. And if you think about COVID, I think, then you think right away about what happened in New York. So you've been there since the beginning. So first tell me your background, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the trajectory of COVID. And then we're going to get to what I really want to talk about, which is something I read about a COVID neurology registry. So how did a nice girl like you get to be in the position that you're in?
um, so I am from New York originally, and I do love being here. But as you said, we had a very challenging spring. So I'm a neurointensivist. I work in the ICUs under normal conditions, and under COVID conditions, I also was working in medical ICU taking care of COVID patients, which we're still doing now with our second surge. But this surge is nowhere near as bad as what we had in March. It was, I honestly describe it as practicing disaster medicine. Patients in all over the place, a variety of different types of specialists caring for these patients, surgeons, podiatrists. We were really calling in all of the troops. It was that busy. I'm sure you saw, we had field hospitals outside, uh, patients in all different buildings that were not initially purposed to be hospitals that got repurposed in a very rapid period of time. Um, so it was certainly a challenging time, and I think we really learned a lot from that initial experience, which helped us during the second wave that we've been dealing with recently.
Before we get into the details of the neurologic complications, I wanted to ask you a little bit about vaccine hesitancy. I've been using this program to talk a little bit. In fact, Dr. Ken Tyler, I just had a nice discussion with him. Of course, he's a neurologist and a specialist in infectious disease, particularly neurologic infectious disease. And we talked about vaccines, and it seemed that we were both on the same page regarding vaccines. So let me ask you, in New York City, where people really had a shoulder to shoulder sort of exposure to what happens when you get COVID, does vaccine hesitancy, is that really exist?
Unfortunately, it does. There's certainly, even in the healthcare system, because we had access to vaccines as the first priority, and we did have hesitancy even in certain groups that had as much access to the vaccine as other groups did. So there are some uh, presuppositions about vaccination that are longstanding that I think we're kind of gradually working through. So we do have barriers to utilization and access of vaccination that we definitely are working on in New York. And New York is an extremely diverse community, as you know, a lot of different attitudes and perspectives. So it is something that we also have to work on, despite the fact that I think a lot of people had direct personal experience with COVID.
That's
It's
interesting.
still a concern.
What about you yourself? Have you been vaccinated, if you don't
Oh,
mind me
oh
asking?
yes, yeah.
Yes.
I had no issues whatsoever. I got vaccinated on a very busy day. I was working in the ICU and was completely fine.
Well, early on, I started seeing articles about the neurologic complications of COVID-19. And of course, I reviewed them, and I think I gave a grand rounds on them. But it was a big project because every week there was another article, and it's like, yikes, this is like a full-time job just
I,
keeping up, right?
I did several grand rounds on COVID at different institutions, and as someone described it as drinking out of a fire hydrant, which is true. It's just, I mean, I had to really rejigger the talk almost every week that I gave it. So yes, it's a moving target.
And our hospital, actually, where I work, has set up a clinic now for post COVID infection, neurologic, well, post COVID infection care, some of which is people complaining of neurologic. So I had the idea, I said, wouldn't it be great if I could keep a track of, what the complaints are, how many people come back with persistent headaches or fatigue or something. And then I saw somebody else is doing this on a national level. Tell me about this program.
Yeah, so this is an NIH funded, NINDS funded COVID, we call it COVID Neuro Databank and Biobank. And so it's a repository currently nationally, although we would like to expand it internationally also, for data on neurologic complications in patients that have a COVID diagnosis, either by PCR or antibody testing. So there has to be laboratory confirmed COVID for these patients. And then we're interested in either new or worsened neurological sequelae. So not only are we interested in people that developed, as you said, perhaps headaches or some other complication after being diagnosed with COVID, but also folks, for example, with dementia who had worsened trajectories of cognitive function after having COVID, for example. Those are also patients that we're collecting information on. We use something called a global unique identifier, which allows the data to still be de-identified, but we can link it to future longitudinal data, which I think is one of the important parts of this. So, we're very interested in having folks who want to contribute their in a prospective fashion, or even if they already have a data set, they can contribute that. And we do reimburse people for their time and efforts in this. So there's
First of all, I had this great idea, right? And then I had no idea how to execute it because immediately it was like, well, I'm going to need some help. I'm going to need somebody to write all this down and save it in a computer. And then, as you point out, it has to be anonymous to protect patient privacy. And I mean, how does this get off the ground? How do you get funding? How do you get like a national thing? How does this actually happen?
So, initially we did our data collection locally. So we have a large data set that we collected in a short period of time because of the surge in New York. We have a data set of like 5,000 patients in the spring alone, of which about 14%, 600 and plus, had neurological events during hospitalization. And we track those patients. We have 6-month outcomes, and we're about to do our 1-year outcomes on those patients. And from that local institutional data set, we crafted, common data elements, which took a fair amount of time to do. But now those are available, and we ask that different sites, will provide you with the data bank, and then you can fill in these common data elements prospectively. But if you already have data collected that's similar to what we're looking for, on the back end, we can recode it into our data set. So effectively, it's done through REDCap, which is a free databasing tool that most institutions have access to. And it can be transmitted easily through that interface. So, if you're interested in sites that are interested in participating, we don't just want academic centers. We also are interested in, community physicians who may see things that are different than what are seen in an academic setting. Effectively, if interested parties reach out to us basically by email, and then we can set them up and onboard them and so forth.
Okay, so I'm a very busy doctor, right? And I've got patients coming and going, and I'm being interrupted. And one of my patients that day says, "Oh, yeah, I had COVID, and now, I don't know, my right leg is numb." So it's like, okay, so I examine him. Maybe he needs a test. We'll try and figure it out. And then, oh, yeah, there's this database. So what can I do in 30 seconds to somehow get this information to you? What do I actually have to do? Do I send an email to Jennifer.Frontera, or is there a better email than that? What do I do?
We have a website. It's an NYU website, but it's called, Neuro COVID Databank and Biobank, and that.
Okay, I'll put that up here on the screen so people
Oh,
can
sure,
see.
yeah, I will give you the website link. Um, so effectively, folks can reach out to us that way who want to participate. But there is a certain amount of time commitment on the end of the contributor, so which we do reimburse for. So you would have to go through and fill out the data elements that we're looking for. There's some core elements, so as not to be too onerous, and then there's some more advanced elements depending on what kind of patient it is and what institution is capable of doing, et cetera. So um, yeah, there is a little bit of commitment certainly from participants, but which is why we do reimburse folks for their time and effort.
So if
And
I submit a patient, then I'll get a check for $5 in the mail for my time and trouble, something like that.
something like that.
Something like that.
Not $5, but yeah.
Maybe a little bit more, but that money is actually coming from the National Institutes of Health, right? It's
That's
U.S. government. This is a U.S. government funded, um, investigator initiated, right? Yourself and others that I guess there were several academic institutions that got together and say, "Hey, we're already doing this, right? Let's nationalize or globalize this project so we can really make it work." And in
NYU
this,
is actually the parent site that's funded. And then we reach out to contributors effectively, and then pay the contributors for the by patient for the number of patient data that they submit. And then of course, folks have the option, if people are interested in publishing off of this data bank, they can submit proposals. We have a whole writing group and that goes through different proposals and releases the data to those who want to publish it. For example, we also have a biobank, I should mention. So biospecimens can be stored at NYU in our biobank, or they can be stored locally, and then we'll keep a virtual registry of different biospecimens. So people that want to do biospecimen projects, we really need the power of multiple institutions, can also apply for aliquots of those biospecimens to run whatever project they're proposing. So that's another concept here. And linking the data to the biological specimens really increases the power of this particular data set, and would allow us to drill down on some of the mechanisms of neurological phenomenon that we might see in the context of COVID.
and by biospecimen, what do you mean?
It really could be anything even from like nasal swabs, which most people have for their PCR diagnosis, to serum, plasma, CSF, tissue specimens or brain specimens. All of those are options. And the reimbursement for biospecimens is different. If you want to do biosharing, obviously it's more expensive to coordinate and ship. But of course, as I said, we're also keeping local registries. So if people want to keep their biospecimens local, we can virtually register them. So it's a resource for other investigators that want to utilize that kind of data.
So I'm just imagining there's some giant freezer in the basement of NYU with lots of little drawers and numbers, and that's where all this stuff is.
Yeah, they have a separate NIH funded core biospecimen repository. And so we're just building off of that core that already exists. So linking, and they have all their processes in place for de-identifying and archiving specimens and so forth, and specimen storage. So we're building off of a platform that's already present.
Well, that's fascinating. So one of the medical issues that came up when I was reading about all of these complications, it was like, well, a lot of these neurologic complications are really just neurologic complications of sick people, right? You work in the ICU, and when people are in the ICU and they're on a ventilator and they're sedated, all kinds of bad things happen to them, and that are neurological. They have muscle wasting, they can develop neuropathy. I'm not telling you the list because you don't know. I'm just, sort of giving some examples. They can have strokes. So, and these were all being reported as neurologic complications of COVID. And I felt that was really yes, but no. In other words, these are not unique. These are just neurologic complications of being really, really sick. So how are you distinguishing those from something that might actually be a true, neurologic complication that's virus specific, or is there such a thing?
Very good point, and I'm 100% on board with your perspective. What we saw, at least in our cohorts, was the vast majority of what we were seeing was related to critical illness or hypoxia, or really secondary effects of COVID. So either the hypercoagulable state that we know is associated with COVID, hypoxia, septic encephalopathy, seizures that we know can occur in the context of sepsis or hypoxia. The unique things we did see are, which has been pathologically supported, are, some of the intracerebral hemorrhages that were odd and occurred at the gray-white junction or were multifocal. And, some of this plethora of gradient echo microhemorrhages. So the pathological data that has shown endothelial abnormalities in COVID, though the virus has not been directly seen, and I'm just referring to the New England Journal article that came out about a month ago looking at endothelial injury. Again, we don't know the exact mechanism. We don't think it's from direct viral invasion necessarily of the endothelial cells, but there is something unique about the intracerebral hemorrhages. There might be something unique about the ischemic strokes also. We did notice that they seem to be more cryptogenic, perhaps embolic strokes of unknown source, so-called ESUS type strokes. So there's something interesting about the neurovascular component post-COVID, but I agree, not necessarily related to the direct viral invasion, but rather secondary effects of the virus. I personally, looking at the encephalitis and meningitis literature, I honestly, if you take a really skeptical approach to this, there have not been reports that have convincingly shown direct viral causes of meningitis or encephalitis, right? We just did a review of CSF literature in COVID, so it's like 400 papers or whatever. 5% showed, were able to demonstrate PCR positivity, but probably a lot of those related to blood contamination of the CSF specimen. So, if you look at the cycle threshold for COVID, they're pretty high. And higher cycle threshold means that you have to amplify that much more before you can even detect the virus. And so it probably reflects contamination. And then if you look at CSF antibodies, which are not something you can commercially run, right? You have to run it in one of your own labs. Sorry. Really, there's only one paper we found where people actually saw evidence of increased IgG synthetic rate, and no one's really shown IgG or IgA or IgM titers for COVID in the CSF that are higher than in the blood. So most of what people are detecting is actually just blood contamination of the CSF. And then if you want to look at the neuropath literature, which is extensive, Um, there's issues with that also. So though people have PCR viral particles in the brain, or done in situ hybridization and found these particles in the brain, or done immunohistochemistry. There are a lot of issues about cross-contamination, particularly if you're looking at olfactory endothelium, where we know the virus goes, cross-contamination of those cells with neuronal tissue. If you do bulk PCR, that's an issue. And then, even when it has been seen in the brain, the areas of virus do not co-localize with areas of neuropathological damage. All right. So, do you have a leaky blood-brain barrier that's caused by hypoxic ischemic brain injury, and then the virus can just wander in? That's potentially what could be happening. It might not be virulence or direct neurotropism or damage caused by the virus. It might just be a secondary bystander that wanders in after you have anoxic brain injury or some other primary mechanism of brain damage. So I think largely I'm completely in your camp in the sense that most of what we see neurologically in the hospitalized setting is secondary effects of COVID. Now, in the outpatient setting, when we start talking about long COVID and brain fog and cognitive issues, I think it becomes a little bit trickier, and we have a lot less data in the outpatient setting than we do in the inpatient setting. So I think
Where can we learn? You mentioned a paper that you had put together. Is that already, for those who want to sort of dig deeper into those findings you were talking about earlier, is that already published, that CSF cerebral spinal fluid paper? Or
yeah, that just came out on PubMed. Our original article looking at was a prospective study of neurologic complications in hospitalized patients, was published a few months back in Neurology. We have another paper looking specifically at encephalopathy that's coming out as well, accepted but not on PubMed yet. And then we have some other, our prospective 6-month outcomes and some of our long hauler data is under review right now. So,
so a lot to learn. Well, we're running out of time. I think we have a mixed message. And the first part of that message is, if you have a patient with COVID or you have a specimen that you want to send to the repository so that it can be studied, because they have a lot to learn. It's a new disease, right? It's a new disease. We don't really know what it does. It's not like, tuberculosis, that we pretty much have that down, all the different things it can do. COVID is still kind of a bit of a mystery. So if you have a sample, please send it. On the other hand, if you haven't had COVID yet, please get a vaccine so we don't have so many samples, right? we don't really want those samples, right? We'd rather that people stay healthy and stay out of the ICU and we don't see so many complications. So that's our mixed message. If you have a sample, send it. But if you're not sick, get the vaccine so you don't get sick. And we don't need to learn about every single potential complication of this disease. Let's see less of it instead of more.
I would 100% agree. I think that the potential side effects of a vaccine, which are minimal, are vastly outweighed by the risks and the issues we've seen with people who have gotten COVID itself. So I can't agree more and stress more that vaccination is certainly the safest way to go.
Dr. Frontera, I want to thank you for joining us on the Art of Medicine. It's certainly been instructive and enlightening. And I will put up the link information so that people who have potential cases to contribute will be able to contribute to increasing our knowledge of this new disease. Thank you.
Thank you.